This is California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, and we are coming to you from Sacramento, California, the state's capital. We are joined by Bob Huff. He is the GOP leader in the California State Senate. And sir, boy, it's a barn burner when you talk about the issue of affirmative action. I've spoken with one of your colleagues, Ed Hernandez, sponsored a bill that would have put on the ballot a repeal, I guess you could say, of Proposition 209 at some level, did not get out of the Assembly. Who would have thunk?
Well, it got out of the Senate just fine.
It did.
It sailed over there, actually, as it did a couple times before when this issue was brought up through statute. The previous two times were vetoed by Governor Schwarzenegger, then later by Governor Brown, although Brown said he supported the idea. It was just it was the wrong mechanism, so that's why it came back as a constitutional amendment.
So let's back up and talk about the fundamental question. Affirmative action, a term that was created, I presume, and it begs the question about diversity and at what price diversity and how much you want to push for affirmative diversity. What's your sense of that?
I think in the mid-'60s, when you had a whole civil rights revolution, that it was necessary to sort of level a playing field in a way that had been very skewed in the past. We're 50 years after that, and Prop 209 was passed in 1996, and at that point, the voters, by 55 to 45 vote, decided that it was probably time just to let merit in things other than race decide who got into our public schools, how we did contracting and jobs, things like that.
What's interesting is you look at the statistics today, and through the meritocracy, what we see is disproportionate acceptance to our public universities amongst Asian Californians. And that has caused some interesting bedfellows when you look at whether we should repeal Prop 209. What do you make of this?
Well, what they often do, the proponents of reinstating affirmative action will say that the numbers have gone down, it's terrible, and it has gone down for Latinos and blacks at UCLA and at Berkeley.
Right.
However, system-wide, they've gone up. You have twice as many Latinos involved. The population has grown in the meantime, but so has admission. So there are twice as many as there were when Prop 209 took effect. And the same thing with blacks had 4% before they're at 4.3%.
I've looked at some of those numbers, and the Latino numbers are all right. You know, I mean, I'm not taking a position, but they're all right. The Asian numbers, as I said, disproportionate. The African American numbers are abysmal. I mean, no other way to say it. Again, not taking a position.
Right.
But it is interesting to look at trends and see where they go. But again, the challenge on the question of Asian Americans, Asian Californians is, where do we go from here? Do we want our public universities to reflect the demography of our state, where Asian Americans are 12, 15%, whereas at some of these larger campuses, Asian Americans are 40% of the population?
Well, we are, in fact, some are higher than that, but we are a very diverse state. And when you look at system-wide, again, before they were all skewed into two of our universities. Now they're spread out throughout the system. So you can make a very strong argument that everybody has a better education system throughout our university and Cal State system because after Prop 209, they have been spread out and they're not just clustered in the two, arguably the top two in the system.
I want to get a sense from you, and forgive me for sounding flippant, but I don't mean to be. Is there a time where we need to look at affirmative action for European Americans?
Well,
but I mean, you look at some of these numbers and one could argue.
Oh, the Caucasians have definitely been the biggest recipients of the Asian influx. I think it was Ronald Reagan, and I have to check out this quote, but he made a comment when somebody said, well, you're going to get a lot more Asians if you have affirmative action, or you don't have affirmative action. He said, I don't mind if it's 100% Asian if they all got there by merit.
And let's talk more about it when we come back. We're speaking with Bob Huff. He is GOP Senate leader. For our viewers on HLN, we thank you for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. What's interesting about this conversation, and I've thought about it this way, is an African-American student sitting next to you of benefit by mere nature of their African-American status? Or does it matter what their socioeconomic status is? Because one could easily argue a wealthy African-American doesn't really bring diversity to the table. Or do they?
You know, I think it was Chief Justice that said the only way we're going to stop discrimination of color is stop discriminating by color or something like that, very similar. And, you know, every population has nuances, you know, that are exceptions. So when you're just using color, it's a problem. I think poverty is probably a better indicator, because if you can break the bonds of poverty by getting an educational opportunity that previous generations haven't had, that's probably a better way to help people up and get them into a better paying job.
And under 209, can the systems look at socioeconomic status?
Oh, they absolutely have been looking at, so I mean, what they've done is a better job of recruiting the demographic they want, so they're not discriminating by, but they can recruit particular classes of people. And so you have half the students that go to our CSUs and UCs don't pay anything, because we have a sliding scale in economic need. So you have national grants, the Pell Grants, you have the Cal Grants, you have the university grants, so that we have a lot of high poverty people that are getting to the universities and CSUs. So from that standpoint, the system is getting economic diversity, and therefore I think that's how they've been able to keep the population populated throughout the system.
Senator Hernandez is also focused on gender diversity. And if you look at the statistics, there could be an argument that Prop 209 has been of detriment to one gender versus the other, and that we need to allow at least that element to be considered.
Well, I don't know. There's arguments to be made for everything. They'll say you don't have enough women engineers, but how many women want to become engineers, you know? And if you're on a merit system, if we're competing against China, or we're competing against, you know, Norway or whatever it is, outside of the nation, you've got to compete eyeball to eyeball, nose to nose, and they're not going to give a rat's tail about, you know, what neighborhood you grew up in or whatever else. Can you compete internationally? And that's, I think, where our focus has to be.
What about competition from private institutions? Because they can admit as they choose. They can use all the affirmative action they want, and they do. And so some have argued that because Berkeley, UCLA, Cal Poly, whatever it may be, cannot use affirmative action, they are losing some of the best and the brightest that on pure numbers don't pan out, but in reality are as bright or brighter than the other students.
The key significance is when you look at the Ivy League schools, they are private, they can cook the books however they want, and they do. The Asian admittance has pretty much flatlined the last 20 years, even though the Asian population has doubled. I'm a public policy maker, so when my tax dollars are supporting the education, I want to support it in a fair, predictable way. You can't help what country you're born in, what color your skin, and what race you is. You can, to a degree, determine whether you're going to study, you're going to hit the books, you're going to, you know, work an extra job to get that education. I can't change the color of my skin.
But we do know that ethnicity has a role, or has played a role, in resources. I mean, let's face it, European Americans, Asian Americans, they, you know, it's the tiger mom concept. Whereas we don't see as many tiger moms in communities of color. So should that be taken into consideration?
I think the whole issue, we are talking about where the goalposts are, rather than how do you kick the football through the goalposts, meaning we need to be focusing on our K or even pre-K, but early on through 12, so that we get graduates that are competent, that are ready to enter the universities. We have so many that graduate from high school, take the exam, and they still need remedial training. You know, so if we can get behind them and help them become better students, even though they get the minimal requirement for college, doesn't mean they're ready for college. We got to do a better job of that.
So with the demise of the repeal of 209 in the Assembly having occurred, is the debate over, or do you perceive that we will continue to debate this question?
The debate is over for this year, although they're going to have task force, I guess, hearings. I think that's just to gin up support for their side of the issue, but I think it's going to come back next year. They want to get this on the 2016 ballot, so this may have won a small little skirmish, but the war, if you want to use that metaphor, is still raging.
What do you think about 2016, a presidential year, presumably a more Democratic electorate, but query whether Democrats are necessarily in favor of repeal?
Well, you look at Asians; they supported, I think, about 75% Democrat ticket last time. So this is not a Democrat-Republican issue. This is a fairness issue. And which side do you think fairness is on?
He is Bob Huff. He is the GOP leader of the California State Senate. My name is Brad Pomerance, and this is California Edition.
Which University of California campus has had the highest number of Latino students enrolled? Berkeley, Los Angeles, Riverside, or San Diego? UC Riverside has had the greatest number of Latino students enrolled.
It's California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance coming to you from Sacramento. We are joined by George Runner. He is a member of the Board of Equalization. And I want to speak with you as a historian of the state of California. You are quite the historian yourself. How is it that California has an elected Board of Equalization? And how did the word equalization get in that title?
Yeah, you know, and again, people don't realize California is the only state that has this directly elected tax board.
I did
no
not
other
know
state
that.
has that.
I did not know that.
And so, I mean, I think that's significant because what it means is taxpayers are very much like constituents then, just like when I was in the Senate or the Assembly or a congressional member. You look at the folks who voted for you as your constituents and you want to serve them.
Right.
That's what your job is.
Right.
And so, therefore, I look at my taxpayers out there and in my district as constituents who we want to help and serve.
And what's interesting, if I may, is California has 4 members of the Board of Equalization. So you represent, almost 10 million people.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, that's bigger than how many states? Probably
Right.
40 states.
Right.
Huge district. And you specifically, don't you have a large geographic district
Well,
yourself?
yeah, my district actually starts down in almost to Riverside County and then runs up the whole kind of east side of the state of California, including the Central Valley, all the Central Valley then, to the Oregon border.
Wow.
So I have like 60%, 65% of the land area of the state and just under 10 million people. So anyhow, so what happened is back in the late 1800s, the railroads were having difficulty because each county was assessing their properties differently.
I love this stuff, by the way.
And,
Keep going. I love
so,
this stuff. Keep
so
going.
they'd go from county A to county B, and the county assessor would have a different way of assessing their property. And of course, they were big property owners.
Sure.
So they went to the legislature. The legislature then decided to put on the ballot a constitutional amendment to create this Board of Equalization. Clearly, the idea of equalizing.
Equalization, got it.
Equalize property taxes between counties, so that instead of each county assessor then deciding what the value of that property is, it would now be a Board of Equalization that would decide. And so that's how it began, and that's what it was. Now, the reason why there's 4 is because at that time, there were only 4 Congress members representing the state of California.
Come on.
So the first districts were basically the same as the congressional members back who represented California at that time. So that's why we have 4, and that's why that happened. So since then, of course, we still do. We still value, one of our jobs, or what we do is we value what's called state-assessed properties.
Right.
So it would be like railroads or gas lines or cell towers, things that have a county, move between county to county.
Do you know how the controller wound up being the 5th member?
That was just back in the beginning. That was just part of the deal. They needed a 5th member, and so they chose the controller as being then the 5th member of that board.
So do members of the Board of Equalization have any, I know the answer, but talk to me through it, legislative power per se?
Well, let me really quickly in regards to the controller too. It's kind of interesting. That's why the controller can send a deputy to a lot of the things that we do, like we do sales and tax or other kind of taxes and fees.
Right.
The deputy can vote for those things.
Oh, really?
Because the legislature, they came out of statute, law that the legislature did. When it comes to the issue of property tax, the controller himself or herself have to come and actually act on and vote for those things because that's what the state constitution requires. So that's on that issue of controller.
Any more anecdotes before we
I
have
don't
to
know.
break?
Hopefully the listeners are still interested in this, right?
Well, what's nice is, though, is that as the elected member representing a quarter of California, you are able to act as the eyes and ears and look for potholes in the road for taxpayers.
Well, you asked about the idea of legislative. We basically interpret the law that has been made.
And when we come back, I want to talk about some of those interpretations because you have many tips for us about the potholes that may be in the road. For our viewers on HLN, thanks for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back with Senator George Runner, a member of the Board of Equalization. Okay, sir, I want to talk about some of those potholes because, let's start with one, because a friend of mine was struck by this. It's known as spouse's liability. Explain the pothole, I'll call it a pothole, regarding spouse's liability.
Well, the issue is that you may have a spouse that's in a business and you may not have anything to do with that business.
Nothing.
But because you have, that money goes into your joint checking account or those kinds of things, all of a sudden you now have liability for what it is that the spouse may not be paying. We've had some very, it
can be sad.
It can be sad. It can be very sad because somebody can be actually not involved at all, and all of a sudden, because of the law, because of the way it reads, they all of a sudden have some liability.
Is there anything a spouse can do in advance of a problem to protect him or herself?
Well, make sure that if you have nothing to do with the business, that's clear. That you're not, it's for instance, a corporation. Sometimes, you're there, the spouse is automatically put on the board as the secretary of the board.
And that's what happened with my friend.
And even though they have nothing to do with it. Well, all of a sudden you become an officer of the corporation, you are now in. Or make sure the money then that's going into that goes into a separate bank account rather than the one that you keep as a family. Those would be things that would help you do that.
Speaking of separate accounts, you would recommend to Californians, especially business owners, that there be a certain segregation of funds to make sure taxes are paid in a timely fashion. Explain that, sir.
Well, what happens is, businesses are truly doing a service for California by collecting a sales tax.
And explain that. We forget that. That's
right.
How they really are.
I mean, in some states, and I wish it was true in California, the state actually gives them back some money for the time that they do of collecting the tax. California doesn't do that, unfortunately.
Okay.
But
change that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to, but unfortunately, I don't think we got a legislature is open to that. But the idea there is that they are collecting the tax and then remitting it. In the law, in the true law, it's actually the business owner who's responsible for the tax. The law allows for them to collect it from the citizen out there, the person who's making the purchase, but doesn't require that. So anyhow, the business owner has to do that. So what happens with businesses sometimes is, you just had a really tough month. And so you just say, well, I'm going to use that money I collected for sales tax, and I'm going to help pay for something this month.
Bad idea.
And next month it'll get better. And next month it doesn't get better. And that's really why we truly say, hey, it's better off just to write the check, set it aside, so you're not tempted at that point.
How often are businesses supposed to remit the sales tax?
Well, it depends. Usually it's once a quarter, but you could get a monthly or you could get an annual, depending upon how big your business is. But usually they remit the sales tax about once. I'll tell you, there's another real key one there too, and it's called successor liability.
Oh yes.
This is one that I really,
deadly.
I feel so sorry for sometimes. Somebody buys a business, and they do it on a handshake, because they were the cook at the restaurant, and the owner says, "Hey, I'm thinking about selling my business. You want to buy it?"
Family
Cook says,
member.
"Great. I'm going to go ahead and I'll do that." And so they just handshake, and all of a sudden that individual, the cook, now begins writing checks, and all of a sudden, and they just found out that all of a sudden the previous owner had a tax liability. And now all of a sudden that becomes their tax liability. So it's really important when you buy a business that you get a certificate of tax paid from the Board of Equalization. Because that means you've gone to them, you've said, hey, is there any taxes owed on this business? And if they say no and send you a certificate, you're not going to be responsible for that. But if you don't, the idea is that somehow you were in collusion potentially with that individual, and now you tried to get them off the hook, and you got them off the hook, and now it's you. And so it's really dreadful, because people really go into it with the best of intentions, and then all of a sudden find out that the guy that they thought was their best friend is no longer in California, and they end up holding that whole bag.
And along those lines, what that tells us is we need to keep records for an extended period
and
of
that's
time.
really hard, because you know what happens? I find that people are enthusiastic and excited about starting their business, and you know what? They are people who are they're restaurateurs,
they're creative,
or they're dry cleaners, or they're whatever they are, and they're not tax people. But it's so important to get a good start. That's why we offer tax consultation. Everybody who takes a new permit in my district, which is a quarter of the state,
right.
I send them a letter saying, hey, look, I will send somebody out there to sit down with you and help you know what it is and how it is that you need to go through your tax issues before they even start their business.
Wow.
Because the problem is, if all of a sudden they ignore some little thing, 3 or 4 years later when they get their audit, it's a big thing. And it's enough to put them out of business.
His name is George Runner. He is a member of the Board of Equalization in the state of California. My name is Brad Pomerance, and this is California Edition.
California's Board of Equalization administers programs which account for what % of all state revenue? 15, 25, 30, or 50%. BOE administrated programs accounted for more than 30% of all state revenue.
It's California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from Sacramento, California, and we are joined by Anthony Cannella. He is a member of the California State Senate, representing significant portions of the Central Valley, which, sir, I know is dry. Stated simply, it's dry. How dry is it?
Well, it's so dry. I mean, obviously, we're experiencing a drought, but also we haven't built any substantive water infrastructure for the last 50 years. So we're looking at a scenario in the Central Valley. We could have almost 1 million acres of fallowed ground. What that means in my district, there'll be portions that could see upwards of 60% unemployment. Now, these are already very poor communities that could devastate the entire town, in fact. So that's how bad it is.
I want to talk about storage. It is the buzzword of the day. I was recently in Washington, D.C., interviewing some members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. I come here often to interview members, and it does seem as if there is some consensus on the need for storage, but it's not clear how much money should be dedicated to storage and what storage includes. What can you tell us?
Yeah, and that's exactly the fight, right? So it's the dollar amount is getting close on the various bonds, but it's really, I want to build large reservoirs, and a lot of other folks want to build smaller, maybe groundwater storage or regional projects, which I think we should do as well. Sure. The problem is, in my district, we're an ag-based economy for the most part, and a lot of the water that we use for ag comes from the reservoirs. Well, a lot of that is going to environmental purposes now, either for river restoration, unimpaired flows in the rivers to try to bring those back to what they were 100 years ago, or other environmental uses. So the farmers are losing more and more of their water. So if we're able to build more surface storage, then we can do both. We can provide farmers the water they need and the environmentalists the water they need.
Are you looking for new surface storage, or would you be willing to consider storage that improves existing dams and reservoirs, removing silt or increasing height of dams?
Sure. So as far as removing silt, I've heard those numbers as well, and I don't think those are accurate. Okay. So I want new storage, so Temperance Flat, Sites Reservoir, but also a modification to existing reservoir, Las Forqueras, Shasta. So I think whatever we can do to get new water, I think for me it's all about new water, then I'll support. But we have got, when you look at Fresno County, Kern County, those areas, you have the Friant Reservoir, the Friant Water District. And if we built Temperance Flat, then that helps supplement water for those farmers. So we really have to be talking about new water because we've got, changing weather patterns, climate change, less snowpack, and that was our original storage. Now we're losing that, we're having more runoff. We have to have the ability to catch that because if we don't, it goes out to the ocean and then it's lost forever and we face similar circumstances we face now.
So when I speak with folks in Sacramento, Democrats and Republicans, there seems to be some consensus on how to address the issue. Again, like you said, the numbers are up for debate and whether we do surface storage, groundwater, or whatever it may be. In Washington, not a lot of consensus. Is that of concern that in Washington they're really fighting about water, or is it okay because California can handle its own issues?
Well, I think in some, I don't have a lot of faith in Congress. I mean, they had a hard time passing a farm bill. So at some point, I think we have to rely on ourselves. And when we're looking at a water bond, my water bond that I submitted is $9.2 billion. I think Anthony Rendon from the Assembly, his bill's up to about $8 billion or so.
Is that true?
He's at $2.5 billion for storage. I'm at $3 billion. So I think it needs to be between that. But it really comes down to how we do it. For example, the disagreement now is on continuous appropriation.
Explain, that's important.
So that means once the bond's passed, that money is always set aside for storage projects. And in the 2009 bond, that was really for large reservoirs. The new bonds from Rendon and Wolk, they don't have a continuous appropriation. So what that means is that money will go towards smaller projects because it takes so long to entitle a new reservoir. I mean, I have a shopping center in my hometown. It's been in court for 7 years. So, and that's really not a very controversial project. Wait till we try to propose a new reservoir. That's going to be a 20-year project.
When we come back, I want to talk more about the drought, talk about the Delta, an important issue for your community as well. For our viewers on HLN, I want to thank you so much for joining us. For our other viewers, we'll be right back. Sir, let's talk about the Delta. Does the north part of your district hit the Delta, or you don't go that far north?
My district does not include any of the Delta. However, it does not diminish the importance of the Delta. 23 million Californians get their drinking water through the Delta. And as the Army Corps of Engineers has pointed out, there's a 99% probability of catastrophic failure of the Delta system over the next 50 years. When 23 million people get their water from that, that's a statewide crisis. So anything we do has got to be healthy for the Delta. We've got to rebuild levees, we've got to do restoration, so we have to invest in that.
So there are two elements of the Delta question. As part of the bond, I understand some money will be dedicated to Delta restoration, whatever that may mean. Then there's the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. We'll get to that in a moment. I want to focus on the Delta as we look at it today in terms of the bond. We know that despite many pleas of folks from a variety of circuits and circles, the courts have continually said that the Delta smelt, a small fish, must be protected, and that has caused some challenges for those trying to access water in the Delta. Where does one go with that issue? Well,
and that's exactly right. We've got an Endangered Species Act. We've also got saltwater intrusion. That's part of the problem with the Delta. But that's why I support the governor's plan for the tunnels. The only way to get around the Delta smelt problem is to bypass it. So if we can build tunnels, and again, it has to be co-equal. It can't just be all the water goes to the Delta. There has to be, or through the tunnels rather, there has to be sufficient water for the Delta to keep it healthy. But if we can get around the smelt, they're protected. The downstream 23 million people that drink the water and the farmers get their water as well. I think that seems like a win-win to me.
So let's talk about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. It's a bit confusing, but suffice it to say, it has nothing to do with the bond. Absolutely nothing. It's a $23.45 billion project, which would be paid by the end users, the beneficiaries. But God, lots of controversies. I bet your dad was involved in, as a member of the Assembly, or Assembly was involved in the peripheral canal situation where the voters reversed a decision by then Governor Brown in his first tour. Where do we go with this?
Well, as you said, it's important to make a distinction between the bond and the tunnels. They are not related. The end users would pay for the tunnels. The bond is really about other water priorities, and so what we've got to be careful is not make the water bond a referendum on the tunnels, because that's not what it is. But again, when it comes to water, we've got to look at the whole state. We've got to make sure we have statewide priorities, and again, when more than half the population gets their drinking water from the Delta, we've got to make sure that that's preserved and protected. And I think by building the tunnels, I think that starts in the right direction.
So we look at the bond, we look at the tunnels, but we know that these projects will take time. We're in a drought right now. And so what I'm wondering is, what can we do as Californians, as residents, as businesses, as farmers, whatever it may be? What can we do today in your mind?
Well, really, other than it raining a lot, there's really not much we can do, right? But we can conserve water, and I think the governor's asked for a voluntary 20% conservation for each house. I know my wife and I and my kids.
Is that enough?
May not be.
Right.
May not be. It may become more draconian as we move forward. Who knows what the next level will be if we start, our wells start going dry and we have no water at all.
It's interesting you mentioned conservation, because I had always presumed, simple steps. Don't water as often, take shorter showers, maybe don't flush when you go number one, if I may say. But as I understand it, those are helpful, but they really don't hold a candle to issues like your washer dryer, or washer I should say, your dishwasher. Those are real water guzzlers.
Yeah, well, so we have, in my city series, when I was the mayor, we installed meters on everyone in the city, and that was for conservation purposes.
Okay.
And what I found by monitoring my own water use is really the biggest demand on water is landscape. So when my landscaping's going, so my family will use maybe 400 gallons a day of water. When I have to use landscaping, it goes up to 1,500 gallons. So it's a lot, and so I think we really need to be careful about how much water we use. It's mostly on our grass. I think we should ratchet that down. We can install sensors. There's lots of new technology we can use to make sure we use as little water as possible. And I think we should convert to plants that don't use as much water, so maybe more hardscape. There's a lot we can do.
At the same time, we think about some of the crops that are prevalent in California, and some of them are very water intensive: almonds, grapes. Should it be that we look away from those crops in the future?
Well, I don't think so. I think they're it's a big boon for California. I think what we have to be careful of is converting range land that does not have irrigation rights to maybe permanent crops. Until we can find a better way to have more storage, so we can bring more ag land to production. But almonds and grapes, they help drive the California economy. If we get out of those, then that's lots of people that lose their jobs.
Wine. Yeah, come on.
Wine.
His name is Anthony Cannella. He is a member of the California State Senate. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are coming to you from Sacramento on California Edition.